Welcome to the Back in Business podcast. I'm business journalist, broadcaster and intrepid podcaster, Mickey Clark.
Intrepid?
Yeah.
Well,
it's a new world for me.
He's back in business, grumpy old man. But the other thing about him is he's dedicated to keeping the UK's pub trade open, of which more are coming
Single-handedly.
up. Single-handedly, yeah. And I'm business journalist Liz Barkley. Now, we have a slightly different format for the podcast today, just one guest for an in-depth conversation around about the impact on small businesses of what's been happening, and maybe, if we're lucky, some crystal ball gazing as to what the future might look like in the small business sector. But Mickey, before we move on to that, you've been away for a week. You abandoned us and went on holiday to Norfolk. What was it like in Norfolk? You know, I kind of seem to have been stuck here in London for the past 6 months. You know, how's the rest of the country faring?
I think it varies from place to place. I mean, a few weeks before that, I was in Yorkshire, and I found that a bit strange. But at that point, we hadn't seen any pickup in the amounts of COVID-19 throughout the country. Norfolk, on the other hand, things were starting to bubble up. And although Norfolk is a bit like Kent in that people are taking precautions, and the cases are not that overwhelming. The hospitals are not being overwhelmed. But there is a strange atmosphere wherever you go now, particularly when you try and socialise, in that, yes, people are keeping out of your way. There is the metre or 2 metre rule. But the pubs and the restaurants, I think, are finding it very difficult. And I also think, as someone who's been drinking for more years than I care to remember, that going into a pub now has become a much more... I think it's 50 odd years since when I first started using the pub, but I've been kicked out of more pubs in the past few weeks than I have in the previous 50 years. They're either haven't got room because of the COVID precautions, or, as the other night we were in a restaurant and got kicked out because it was approaching 10 o'clock. And that took me back to the old days of course, when they used to call time at 2 o'clock on a Sunday and 11 o'clock on a Saturday night. And generally speaking, I think as someone who wants to support pubs and thinks they're a hub of the community, I am starting to find it a bit difficult. I'm finding it confusing following the rules. I'm finding it difficult to phone up and book a table, because having a pub, going into a pub with friends is supposed to be a spontaneous thing. It's a casual thing. If you have to start booking tables and getting in at a particular time and leaving by a particular time, I think that takes a lot of the fun out of it. And as I say, I think, without question, it's starting to affect the income coming through the front door for a lot of publicans, but their costs are continuing to go up.
Yeah, and that's what they're saying. That's what restaurants and so on are saying around here, local community around here. Not only do they have the 10 o'clock curfew, but in order to get enough people through in time, one restaurateur said to me the other day, he's having to take on an extra chef. I mean, that's just got to be productive.
I went into the old Neptune in Whitstable about 2 or 3 weeks ago with some of my family, and I'd sneaked off on my own, and they followed me in, and we ended up sitting at the table, 4 of us, having fish and chips as you do. And during the space of 10 minutes, I saw 3 groups turned away because there wasn't enough room because of COVID-19. There was enough room in the pub and you could eat on the beach, but with the wind blowing from the east, who wants to eat on the beach? So you think to yourself, how much longer can a business go on turning that sort of money away? But it's what they're being forced to do. It's madness in terms of, profit margins. But, you put it down to national health and you think, well, yeah, you've got to do it. But I can't see a lot of businesses emerging from this without either being unscathed or not opening their doors at all.
Sorry, the dog wanted out. Do you think we're a bit hung up on pubs and restaurants though? Because that's one of our favourite pastimes. What about the rest of it? What about the rest of the hospitality?
It's a big part of the. It's a big part of the industry. It's a big part of the economy. I mean, hospitality and leisure are already losing, according to their own figures, something like £650 million a week. That soon adds up in terms of GDP. And you go through the streets, every pub, there's a pub on most corners. certainly in the big cities, they struggle in the country, but they remain a hub of the local community. So I think, yes, we do place a lot of emphasis on them, but they deserve to have that emphasis placed on them. And I think we're getting to the stage now where people are thinking, do I want this hassle? Do I want to run the risk of being in a pub and getting COVID-19? Because SAGE seem to be frightening the life out of everyone. And people are getting torn as to what is the best course of action to take. And I don't think they're getting proper clearance from SAGE, the medical experts, the scientists, or the government.
I think, though, that we do have to say that there's a heck of a lot of other industries and sectors that are really struggling. You've got the events sector finding it impossible.
And have been struggling for some time. We can't put all this down to COVID.
No, absolutely
Retail,
not.
for instance,
And I get that.
aerospace have all been struggling. Problems there a long, long time before any of this emerged. But what COVID has done has brought the problems to a head. And I think that's where the industries are struggling to come to terms and find a problem
I get that.
to solve it.
I get that. But also, you've got the theatres, you've got everything going on in the West End of London and in the middle of just about every big city up and down the country, and we've got to have some sympathy for them because they're an important part of the economy too and bring in a huge chunk of money.
I mean, do you understand why the Chancellor brought in a scheme 2 or 3 weeks ago which said that he would pay out and subsidise workers that are already in work? And then he brought out another scheme saying that he would support companies or businesses that were shut down or affected by COVID. He might just as well have kept the furlough scheme going on and targeted it at industries that needed it and not a blanket coverage.
Well, I think we will talk about that. We will talk about that with Miles Celic, who is on the podcast today from the City UK. But I think, I know you're going to hate me for this. I do think it could all end in tears. Am I allowed to say that? He's not laughing. You're not laughing. Mickey.
I thought you were talking to Mickey.
I was talking. No, I was talking.
Habits.
I was talking.
I'm always laughing. She knows it's not me.
Right. So we are going to talk about what's happening in our big cities and how they've been affected. And I think hollowed out is a phrase that is commonly used to describe how many of our cities' centres might end up boarded up if this 3-tier system really impacts businesses, as you've been saying, Mickey. And we will be talking to the CEO of the City UK. But jobs are in everybody's mind alongside the public health issues. And the jobs figures out this week didn't do much to lift anyone's spirits. So let's talk to Jyoti Rambe, who is our chief reporter. Jyoti, unemployment at 4.5% doesn't sound quite as drastic as I'd expected.
No, but I think that's just the tip of the iceberg at the moment. So there are around 2.7 million people claiming benefits, with almost 700,000 more who are jobless in September compared to in March. Now, figures are showing there are new jobs being created and there are more vacancies, but economists are still predicting business closures. Now, the furlough, or the original furlough scheme, the end of that is fast approaching, and it could push unemployment levels to 9 or 10% over the winter. So it's not looking great.
I think that's a bit of an understatement. But it's not just jobs, is it? It's self-employed people as well. I mean, we're differentiating between people who work for themselves and people who actually work for other people. So it's not just jobs where there's bad news.
No, and the self-employment have had it quite tough, especially this week. So the figures released by ONS, so that's the Office for National Statistics, show that the number of self-employed people in the UK has fallen by a staggering 240,000. Now, we've been saying that this sector is vital to the UK's economic recovery, and the government needs to urgently look at offering better support. Now, nearly 250,000 fewer self-employment means that's a huge loss of skills to the businesses when they actually need it the most. Like, they need contractors to help them rebuild and regenerate. And I know this is something we talked about in our podcast last week.
Yeah, and I think Mickey, as a freelancer, I mean, you and I have been freelance for most of our working lives. You know, as a freelancer, you do tend to get called in when your skills fit a gap, a
Yeah.
temporary gap that people have got. And if you lose $250,000 and a lot more on top of that, I suspect, of freelancers who are contractors in everything from IT to new digital skills to artificial intelligence, heaven only knows what, there's going to be huge gaps there when businesses start to regrow.
Liz, this isn't all down to COVID-19 again. This is a problem that we should have been confronting, or our politicians should have been confronting back in Tony Blair's day, that the economy's changing. We need to change with it. We need for people to get into, technology, computerization, aerospace. Those are the jobs where they're crying out for vacancies. Plus the fact we need plumbers, bricklayers. Forget all the university courses for degrees of things that are going to be not pertinent when they leave university. We needed to be retraining people donkeys years ago. We didn't do it. And business itself has to accept a lot of the blame for this, because business has been gorging itself in the past 20 years on cheap labour from particularly Eastern European countries. And now they're finding that all of a sudden the tap is being turned off with that, and they're going to have to look anew. And what you need to have done is 10 years ago, started investing in technologies that can replace these people on minimum wage, but then create new jobs elsewhere. And we haven't done it. We've taken the short-term route, the easiest route all the way along, and as I say, gorged ourselves on cheap labour.
Let's bring in Miles Celic at this point then from the City UK. Miles, the City UK is probably not something everyone has heard of, but it was set up 10 years ago off the back of the last recession to help think about how small businesses might recover in the City of London, but I think the remit's much wider than that now. What about that point, that businesses have been gorging themselves on cheap labour? We haven't done enough to skill up. We haven't put enough money into training, etc. My problem is that I feel that we haven't been thinking far enough ahead.
I think it's absolutely one of the key challenges that the industry, the financial and professional services industry, is facing alongside the rest of the economy. It's where does the next generation of talent come from? And there's a lot of work that's been going on that, and I'll come to that in a minute. But just one of the things that Mickey said that I'd like to pick up on, which I think he's absolutely right about, is that these issues, these challenges about skills, about labour, about the future of city centres, town centres, haven't suddenly come up as a result of COVID. These are challenges that have existed for some time. COVID has acted as an accelerator. What you tend to find, if you look at this historically, every major public health outbreak, every major plague, every major illness that's come along has acted as an accelerator for economic trends that had pre-existed, or technological trends. We're doing this as a Zoom call. We're doing this conversation as a Zoom call. Chances are we'd have done that as a Zoom call maybe 10, 15 years down the line in terms of the way that things had developed. We'd evolved more slowly, people had got used to it, technology had changed, culture had changed, and so on. And in essence, we've concertinaed that evolution that, as I say, may have taken a decade or more into a few weeks, in some cases into a few days. I think there's a couple of things that drop out of that. Firstly, actually for many companies, not necessarily most, but for many companies, it's been a pretty easy transition. Now that's more difficult if you're in retail, if you're in the sort of pubs that Mickey was talking about. Clearly there's been an enormous impact in those parts of the economy, but also it will act as an accelerator. The thing about accelerating change like that is the advantage of stretching out change over time is that you've got time to adapt. People have time to retrain, to develop new companies, to start new product lines, whatever it may be. When you concertina that, you get that kind of growth spurt pain that comes. So the ability to adapt is going to be something that's going to be much, much harder, going to be much more painful in many cases. And that, I think, is where it's incumbent on industries like the one that I represent, but also on governments, and whether that's national, whether that's local, whether that's regional, whether that's devolved. In fact, I was having this conversation with a member of the European Parliament this morning. We're not the only country going through this. These are challenges that are national, regional, international, and indeed global. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us, whether we're in the private sector or the state, to work together on these.
And COVID-19 is a game changer, isn't it? I mean, it's a game changer for all of us. And as you say, it's been compressed. Liz said about, differentiating between pubs and restaurants, and perhaps we're over-egging it. But the point I was trying to make was that these businesses, unlike theatres, and they've been shut down completely, I understand that. But the pubs and the restaurants, we're saying to them, well, come on, you've got a paddle, but we're going to take all your income away from you. And you can't expect businesses to survive if you turn off the tap as far as income's concerned, which is exactly what these measures do.
So I think one of the challenges here is the furlough scheme has been, when you talk to small businesses or organisations that deal with small businesses, and I suspect you've heard exactly the same, the furlough scheme has been the single most important thing for most of these companies in terms of keeping going. And then alongside that, what the government's done, and I think it's absolutely right to have done it, is set up these schemes, these lending schemes that have allowed companies to have the access to cash to keep going through the crisis. Now, I think there is a number of questions that come from that. One is, how long does the furlough scheme, in whatever format or whatever incarnation it goes into, how long does that go? Where is it targeted? I think it's interesting, again, if you look at the European example, I think I'm right in saying the Germans have announced that their slightly more targeted furlough scheme is going on till 2022. Now, some cynics have pointed out that there's a German election next year, so you can draw your own conclusions. But there is clearly an aim in a number of European countries to look at how they can drive that furlough scheme. The loan schemes that have been created were absolutely right in terms of government and the regulators getting behind that and the industry supporting those to give companies cash. But again, further down the track, what you run into is the possibility of an unsustainable debt burden that is going to be problematic for companies as they look to the recovery and how you invest into the recovery. So the government did the right thing in their winter economy plan about extending the terms of payment, extending the amount of time that you've got to repay there. And that buys companies time, it buys them a breathing space. But these are fundamental issues that we're talking about in terms of how the economy adapts as we move into what the future looks like.
So just a couple of points from what you've just said, Miles. So regarding cash flow, it's great that we've got the bounce back loans and the grants, but part of the problem is small businesses and the self-employed are struggling to actually access those. Now, just this week, Metro Bank became the latest lender to stop opening new accounts for businesses. And that's partly because there was a surge in demand for businesses seeking those bounce back loans. Lloyds, NatWest, Santander, they all put opening accounts on hold at the start of the pandemic. HSBC did that a couple of weeks ago, and they also put on hold new applications for bounce back loans. And that's a problem for small businesses who want to get access to cash, funds they vitally need to survive.
And Miles, those small businesses, when you come down to it, are the ones that are going to take the risks and innovate if they've got the wherewithal to do that in order to help the scenario that you've just been talking about.
And look, in terms of what the industry has done working with government on this, it's been an enormous heavy lift. I mean, it has been a national effort. And I think from recollection, there's been more than 57 billion that's been lent into companies since the start of the crisis. I think 1.25 million loans that have gone into small and micro businesses. And clearly, we need to make sure that the loan support is there and the support for businesses is there as the crisis continues. I think one of the challenges here is when we started out in March, nobody knew how long this was going to go on for, and you could argue we still don't. A lot of this is going to depend on how long it takes to get a vaccine in place. A lot of it is going to depend on how deep any recession and how quick any recovery are going to be. And that then creates the challenge, Liz, that you've identified, which is if companies are sat with an enormous amount of debt, small businesses are sat with an enormous amount of debt on their balance sheets, it's going to be very difficult in some cases for those companies to invest into the recovery. to take on new employees, to open new product lines, to expand what they do. So this is where our view from the industry is it's absolutely vital that the government, that local governments, devolved assemblies and industry work together to figure out a way to avoid that, because otherwise we're just hamstringing the recovery. This will act as a drag anchor on companies as they try and make their way forward. And it'll make it much harder for small businesses to play their traditional role, which is one of the biggest drivers of employment in the UK.
Can I ask something that I've been wondering about? And Mickey, you know more about this than I do. Are there big businesses? We've got about 8,000 big businesses in the UK, and we've got about 35,500 medium-sized businesses, and the rest are small. But are those big businesses, the big guys, sitting on reserves of money that they're simply not going to spend until all this uncertainty stops? In which case, again, that would be a reason why we're losing self-employed out of the sector, why small businesses are not doing as well as they perhaps could do, because the guys who normally pay for them, contract them, subcontract them, employ them, are just sitting on that money till they see what's going to happen.
I think it's a difficult picture. You have to take each company and each sector they're in differently, different aspects. I think a lot of the big companies, judging by the amount of FTSE 100 companies that have slashed or done away with their dividend altogether, would imply that either there is a cash shortage or they are conserving cash. Because I think these COVID restrictions frighten the life out of all of them. And what you're seeing now is a huge paring back. You've seen it, a classic example, Marks and Spencer, which had already dropped out the FTSE 100, gone into the 250. And it's then turned around and say, right, we're closing stores, we're laying people off, we're going to slim down for the future. And of course, I think that's right the way across the country with its engineering, retail, and the fact that they've been slashing the dividends does suggest, and I think it's more than half of FTSE companies have so far cut the dividend. I've just plucked that figure out of the air. There have been some updates, but I know it's a high figure. So they're not paying. So shareholders are suffering as well, which means savers will be suffering, which means pensioners will be suffering. And that's when the knock-on effect, ripples right the way through. And to bring on a point that Josie made just now about bank bounce-back loans and the like, what I'd like to know, Miles, perhaps you'd have a better idea than me, all of that is underwritten by the government. What are the banks actually doing during all this? Are they giving out loans?
So the banks are giving out the loans, but it is underwritten, as you say, by the government.
Yeah,
so there's a taxpayer
they're doing the
guarantee.
Government's work.
So
yeah,
it's the fastest way. So again, if we go back to where this started back in March, there was no time to set up a government structure here or a whole new government bank. You do it through the lenders. Now that's the banks, it's the building societies, it's the various non-bank lenders that existed out there. So you utilize the pre-existing mechanisms, the relationships that already exist between a bank and the company, the SME that uses the bank as its lender. So the banks have put the structures in place. There's a 100% guarantee for the bounce back loans. There's a 100% guarantee behind them from the government if the company goes under. So this is a really important point, which is
so this is easy peasy for the banks.
It's not easy. It's not easy peasy for the banks. The point is that guarantee only comes into action if the company fails. So if the company goes under and the loan is therefore lost, or the bank has to foreclose on the company, it then goes to the Treasury, and the Treasury goes, there's the 100% guarantee behind the bank. In essence, that's how it operates. So
does it affect the tier one capital of the banks? In other words, the money they have to put aside to cover the loans they're making in case they go wrong?
So it sits on the balance sheet, but in essence, the way the regulators operate is they're allowed to look through that, recognizing that there is a government guarantee sat behind that particular loan. However,
well, that's what I meant by easy peasy.
Well,
it's government backing and the banks doing their.
Yeah, it's easier in terms of your capital requirement. I think there's a genuine question here, however, about capacity, because if you look at the number of loans that have been put out, the extensions to loans and so on and so forth, whilst it's not necessarily sat there on capital, we do need to be careful that we're not creating additional burdens in terms of just capacity for banks and others, for the building societies and so on, when it comes to the sort of the operational side of driving into the recovery as well.
Can I just shift the topic ever so slightly? We were talking about the hospitality trade. We talked about pubs and restaurants and Mickey's favourite subject. But joking aside, how important is that to the City of London, say? We think about the City of London as being a financial area. We think about Edinburgh as being a tourist place and a financial area. But the City of London itself, it is a financial area. It's where the big banks sit. It's where, you've got the headquarters of great big corporates. How important are those pubs and restaurants, that hospitality trade, to a city centre like that?
I think it's the same whether you're in the Square Mile or in Canary Wharf or in Manchester city centre, Edinburgh, which you've identified. These are businesses. It's the as people have talked about, it's the sandwich shops, it's the hospitality industry, it's restaurants, it's hotels for people who are coming in for meetings or whatever. So those are really important. But the one of the key things here is it's not just that side of things. It's if you think about the banking industry, the insurance industry, asset management, law firms, professional services firms, they also rely on lots of small businesses that might be doing tech, they might be doing data, they might be the creative industries. This is sorry,
accountants.
Yeah, accountants. Exactly. Yeah. And so you are dependent on the people who set up your website, who come in and look after the building for you. So this is all part of a really closely integrated ecosystem of economic activity, these cluster effects that you see that big cities are absolutely fantastic at. So if you're London, if you're Edinburgh, if you're Paris, Berlin, that's why people come to cities. London, for instance, is the highest concentration of high-skilled jobs anywhere on the planet, 1.7 million people. And so being able to drive that, being able to bring that together drives the economy and drives opportunities for small businesses that can provide those services that are so needed by the big businesses.
So the next question for me then is, if we lose that, what do we do to the whole of the UK? So let's say, if we're just focusing on London for the moment, and I know there's lots of other city centres that will be affected too, but if we were to lose that, how does that affect the whole of the UK? And the point that I always worry about when we lose skills is, can we get back what we need? Can we reshape to a workforce that really then thrives again?
So the question here is adaptation. So really, it's how do you adapt to this? And so if you look at so there's a really interesting guy called Professor Carlos Moreno, who is at the Sorbonne in Paris, and Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, is really interested in what he set out. And again, he was talking about this before the crisis, and he talks about this concept of the 15-minute city, which is that you should never be, as a citizen, somebody living in a city, you should never be 15 minutes, more than 15 minutes walk or bike ride away from your key leisure, your key retail, your employment, if at all possible, etc. And so one option here, one possibility is that we see something that looks much more like a collection of villages setting up a city. So you might have a focus of economic activity that can't be moved in places like the Square Mile, Canary Wharf, the financial district in Edinburgh or wherever. But otherwise, for other people, for the rest of the city, and for the rest of your economic activity, you have this sort of village basis. And actually, British cities, in essence, grew up that way anyway. If you look at the history of London, Manchester, Edinburgh, it's a series of villages growing into towns that then grow into cities as they come together. So it's possible that we could be looking at a sort of back to the future for the way that cities operate. That's the positive interpretation. The negative interpretation, if we get this wrong, is that we see this massive sucking out of activity, of economic activity and jobs out of city centres, and that sort of detrimental impact that you've set out. And it's far too early to say which direction we're going to go in. But I think the positive thing here is that we are able, between what government does, what regulators do, what businesses do, I think there's an opportunity to look at this, to build back better, to use a term that lots of people are talking about, and to look at what we can do in terms of making more sustainable cities, more livable cities, better quality of life, and drawing on exactly the kind of expertise and drive and energy that exists in the small businesses that will be the drivers of growth afterwards.
So not only people working in the square mile, people living in the square mile, making purchases in the square mile. So the whole thing becomes a lot more comprehensive as to what it's offering, because I can go back to the days in the 70s and 80s where the square mile was literally just that, the square mile. Now you've got Canary Wharf and you've got other parts of London. Because of technology, you don't have to be that close together. You know, things have started to spill out. But certainly, you know, house prices, you can put that down to the fact that people want to be in London, but they've still got to commute in, and they're still wasting a huge amount of time travelling. And the other thing, Miles, I wanted to ask you this week, the thing that really made me groan was the emergence of what politicians do best. They play politics. And this week we've had it with the government and the different mayors around the country and different attitudes. They seem to be playing politics at the expense of people's health, which is going to rankle eventually. But you've heard Manchester say, no, we're not going into the tier 3 system, and London almost jumping over hoops to get to it. It's a very weird situation, is it? Has this been introducing mayors and local government? Has it just made the situation more complicated?
So, I mean, I'll give a personal view on this, which is that you know, certainly what we've seen in terms of engaging with metro mayors, with the devolved assemblies and parliaments in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, is that people have had a fantastic ability to go, right, this is the impact in our local community. So, you know, Andy Burnham is able to see exactly what the situation is in Manchester. Andy Street in Birmingham, able to see what the situation on the ground is in Birmingham. Nicola Sturgeon doing the same in Scotland. So there's far closer engagement with the potential impact on that part of the country. So, you know, we've spoken to, for instance, the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Welsh Assembly in terms of the potential impact of unsustainable debt on companies in those parts of the country. In terms of of what that means on the public health impact, I mean, I'm not a government spokesperson. I can't talk about how they've found that and what that's meant in terms of how they engage with it. I do think, though, that it is important that whatever government does, excuse me, and business should be doing its best to support this, is to ensure that people don't become disillusioned or lose discipline or lose sight of what we're trying to achieve here, because the job situation is absolutely vital here, the economic situation is absolutely vital here, but it's all coming from a major public health crisis, and that's what we've got to address.
But on saying that, Miles, you know, I was going to say people are becoming increasingly sceptical about the government's ability to stop the economy derailing. Yes, of course, there is the public health side of it that has to be addressed as a matter of priority. But if people lose faith in the government's ability not to derail the economy, that's going to have the same effect, ultimately, is it not, than loss of trust and confidence in our ability to contain the virus.
And this is the balancing act that governments all over the world are struggling with, and I suspect will struggle with for some time still to come. And if you remember, you know, at the start of this crisis, there was a sense that the Swedes, a lot of people thought the Swedes had got this completely wrong, and they hadn't gone for national lockdown. And now some people are pointing to the Swedish example as something the UK should have done, or other parts of Europe should have done. I mean, the reality is certainly in you know, whenever we've looked at this and looked at the international comparators, every economy, every society is going to have to approach this in a way that makes sense from their own perspective. But there is certainly, I think, a growing sense that there are public health implications and a growing recognition that there are public health implications to the economic side of this. So if you shut down economies, if you create long-term mass unemployment, then there are public health implications to that as well. So this is a balancing act. It's, you know, and I'm very glad that it's not one that I'm having to balance out myself.
Well, a lot of people have said that the public health measures and the economic measures seem to be competing against each other rather than complementing. And as a result, that's why businesses are suffering. Now, just today, about a couple of hours ago, I think Lancashire has now officially been moved into the Tier 3 section, so they've got the highest restrictions alongside Liverpool. Now, we're looking at potentially loads of job losses again here because of the effect that's going to have, particularly on the hospitality industry. I know we've touched upon that already. So how do you combat that? What can you do that will help businesses survive?
So I think it comes down to two things. It's the measures that government can put in place to support businesses through the crisis, and then it's the measures that we all need to put in place and need to identify in terms of what is going to work best in terms of how you drive the recovery. And you know, when you think about previous, and this is going to be unlike any other recession we've previously seen, but if you think about previous recessions, it's avoiding what some economists call permanent scarring. So it's that loss of, and Liz, you were talking about this earlier, it's that loss of skills, it's that loss of capacity, it's that loss of investment into growth companies because they can't take it on because they're struggling under too much debt. So for me, this is the absolute time that organisations such as mine and yours ought to be engaging with government and throwing in innovative, creative, radical initiatives at them that reflect the experience that you're hearing in terms of the companies you deal with day to day, of what's going to make the most impact in the short term and what's going to help the whole country return to growth over the longer term.
Well, thank you, Miles, for saying that, because that's exactly what we're constantly trying to do. Sometimes it's not very easy to get an ear of ministers at the minute, simply because everybody seems to be so busy. There's so much thinking going on that it is really difficult. But if you were to say there's one thing I want you, Rishi Sunak, to do, what would it be?
It's a great question. So for me, it would be to work with small companies, medium-sized companies, large companies, civil society, to bring together a holistic, integrated, thought-out view of what does this economy look like in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, as a result of the changes that we're going through. And COVID is part of this. The technological acceleration we're seeing and the social acceleration that we're seeing is part of it. Brexit and the consequences of Brexit are a part of this. I think it would be terrific if the Treasury and the government were able to say, this is the kind of economy we're building, and this is the sort of input and the sort of support that we need from business, and this is what we will provide to small, medium, and large businesses to help drive the economy in that direction. I think this is a real opportunity to have a national conversation, a national discussion about what kind of country and what kind of economy we want. And that's what I'd want the government to lead on.
Well, we've started it here. That's it. We've started the conversation. So hopefully we'll manage to get...
Time for the pub now, though.
says Mickey. That's where he always wants to go. Miles, thank you ever so much for joining us. I know we could carry on this conversation for the rest of the day. It's been absolutely terrific to talk to you. Jyoti, anything else to bring us up to date on before we go?
So I just mentioned Lancashire. We're also hearing that Wales might be going in what they're calling a fire break lockdown, which will mean businesses will have to shut. I think that's pretty much most things. One thing to note though, HMRC is starting its post-payment compliance checks to stamp out misuse of their schemes.
What does that mean? Give us that link.
Table door, all spalted.
So for example, when the self-employed income support scheme was announced, HMRC sent out loads of letters to people who they said would be eligible for the scheme. Now, it has admitted that it sent out around about 100,000 letters to people who had actually stopped trading, and about 30,000 of those went on to apply for the scheme. Now, of those people,
I know we shouldn't be laughing because it is fraud. Sorry. Oh dear
Surprise, surprise.
but just wait for it. But it's determined that only 6,000 of those were actually eligible for the grant. So it's writing to the remainder 24,000 to check if they were actually eligible.
Did you apply for a loan?
And I suppose what they're no joking. If you have had a grant when you shouldn't have had a grant, then you've got to confess by the 20th.
Yeah, they'll have you. They'll get you.
And we're recording on Friday, so that means the day after this podcast is posted, you have to let HMRC know.
Actually, it's 20th of November.
Oh, 20th of November.
Yeah,
great.
so people have got a bit of time if they want to avoid any penalties.
Fantastic. You have been warned.
Yeah, but if you do get a letter, the main thing you have to do is prove that your income and work was affected, and that's kind of the only criteria.
Okay, well, thank you ever so much for that. You have been warned. Mickey, what are you up to this week, other than going to the pub?
Little as possible. I don't think I will be going to the pub now. I'm going to stay at home and save some money, I think. I could save a lot of money during that period.
Is that tenner still in your wallet? You know, the one that Declan managed to extract from you on the very first podcast at the beginning of May?
That was a white fiver. That was a white fiver. Bank of England, I promised to pay the bearer. That's the next thing, of course. We'll have no cash. Cash is going.
There are a lot of people working behind the scenes to try to keep it for people who definitely need to use it, and there are still lots of small businesses that definitely depend on cash. Anyway,
they're bringing shops in now.
We've got to leave it. We've got to leave it there. Otherwise, we'll be here all afternoon. It's been a great conversation, and all our podcast conversations, interviews with politicians, blogs, and so on are on our website at backinbusiness.org.uk. And if you want to comment, if you want to take part, find us on LinkedIn and Twitter at business_backin, or email us at contact us at backinbusiness.org.uk.